Good afternoon and welcome to everybody for starting our Junior Scholar Award session for CyCon 2017. I'm Stefano Biondi, commander of the Italian Navy, more than 20 years in the IT sector, and the last 10 in the intelligence area in Italy. And since last summer, NATO CCD COE, like researcher in the technology branch. And today host for this very nice and hopefully interesting session is School Award. As you can see, this is a session a bit different from all the other sessions. First of all, for the location, as you can see, amazing view, and because of course we have the possibility to see in this session different topics in the same sessions. So today we will see the result of a deep analysis and the selection of a huge number of master theses that we got during our call for this session. Please, join. Hopefully you are in the chair in front as well. Okay. And today, as I say, we have 3 final candidates. 2 of these master theses are based on technical aspects. The third one is based more on legal aspects. We have in this room Junior Scholar Award Committee, the 3 jury members that will assess the final rank for these master theses. And the guys that we present today, their staff, their research, will grant a prize. And the winner of the award will be announced tomorrow by the director of the NATO CCD COE, Mr. Sven Sakkov, during the final session of this conference. So, I would like to remember to use our app, because it's really interesting for us to receive your feedback for the next iteration. Please join us if you want, and you're welcome. And one more interesting thing that I want to remember you is that today in the evening we will have our CyCon dinner, and the dinner will be held in the Sequin Harbor, a very nice and exciting maritime museum. Buses from this hotel leave at 19:15 and we'll be back from the Sequin Harbor at 11 p.m. So you are all welcome. And it's a very nice event to be part of the initial part of the last year. So, as we said, we got different master theses, and we want to see the presentation from this speaker. But before starting with them, let me introduce a bit our jury members that, of course, did part of the job in the selection of this master thesis. And today we will be here to evaluate, to do the final assessment of this research. Dr. Gabriel Jakobson, hi Gabriel, my pleasure. And Gabriel is an NATO CCD COE Fellow, Chief Scientist of Cybergen Consulting, as author of over 120 technical publications, from automata theory to cognitive situation control. And he's chair in some IEEE committee and some committee. It's a pleasure and absolutely. Thank you so much. Now we have Dr. Kenneth Geers, previously committing another panel maybe. Kenneth is a NATO CCD COE master, Commodore Senior Research Scientist, and visiting professor at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv in Ukraine. Thank you so much for your commitment. And our third member, Mr. Tomáš Minárik. Tomáš is a NATO CCD COE researcher in law and policy branch. Before landing here in Tallinn, he worked as a legal advisor at the International Law Department of the Czech Ministry of Defense, and later at the National Cybersecurity Center of Czech Republic. That's right. So, thank you so much for all of you for joining us for our session, and enjoy the presentation. enjoy the sea view, the landscape, but please pay attention to our guys that have put a lot of effort in doing a very good job. So we will start with Mr. John Bank from the Netherlands. Sorry for not so for pronunciation maybe. He got a Bachelor of Law in Groningen University and Master of Laws in Leiden University, but he's still working on his background operation. He's attending and he's ongoing the Master on IT Law, always in Leiden University. That's cool. And actually he's working as a policy officer at the Task Force International Cyber Policies of the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So please, Jos, floor yours.
Okay, thank you, Stefano, for this kind introduction. Welcome, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this interesting session. It's a great honor for me to be here at CyCon, a great and interesting conference on cyber conflict. As Stefano said, I'm Joost Bunk, and I'm a student of international law and IT law in Groningen and Leiden University. Today, I'll present my findings on the thesis I wrote on the protection of intellectual property in cyberspace under international humanitarian law. I'll start off with a brief description of the presentation. I will start with some colliding developments I saw, which motivated to write my thesis on this topic. Then I'll discuss the sources and references, which proved to be a huge problem in addressing my research question. Then I'll come to my analysis and the development of international humanitarian law in addressing my research question. Lastly, I'll connect my findings to the theme of this CyCon, defending the core, and I'll round up with some conclusions. So first up, some colliding developments. Modern day information societies are digitalizing fast and becoming more and more dependent on the production of intellectual property for their economic sustenance. Intellectual property intensive industries contribute, for example, over $6 trillion to the US economy. You can think about high-tech industries, weapon systems, patents, chip producers, trade secrets, source codes, software, you name it. So on the one hand, we have the importance of intellectual property. On the other hand, we see that on a national and regional level, both states and international organizations are developing cyber strategies, doctrines, and offensive capabilities. For example, the NATO, the USA, but also the Netherlands is developing strategies, doctrines, and capabilities. So we have an interest in intellectual property, and we see that cyberspace is becoming more volatile, and states are getting interest in cyberspace. These two developments collide in what General Keith B. Alexander, the former commander of the US Cyber Command, aptly put as the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. Cyber attacks gained to access intellectual property are the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. So this interest in cyberspace, the cyberspace becoming more and more volatile, and the interest in intellectual property, and the discussions on cyber warfare and the possible cyber connection to conventional warfare made me think, to what extent does international humanitarian law, or the laws of armed conflict, the laws of war, protect intellectual property in cyberspace? I addressed this in a comparative legal theory and jurisprudence research. I reviewed over 250 books, cases, articles, treaties, statutes on international humanitarian law, intellectual property, international human rights law, and cybersecurity. So these references and sources prove to be a big part of the problem. Devoya and McCormack aptly put it, the framework of international humanitarian law has not caught up with the recent developments on the concepts of intellectual property and intangible assets. And also, the Talent Manual fails to take the destruction of digital assets sufficiently seriously. There is simply a lack of scholarship on this topic. For example, when I was doing research for my thesis, I searched in the database of both Groningen and Leiden University, and I often got 0 results. In short, okay, the computer says no, or IHL says no. No specific rules, and no sources and references. Great that one. So, finding an answer to the question on the protection of intellectual property under international humanitarian law, I started to look at the protection of property in general under international humanitarian law. And I found out that international humanitarian law provides protection for property as long as it has protected civilian persons, and this protection can be considered international customary international law, so binding upon all states. I saw that in the development of international humanitarian law, you see that treaty texts often refer to property. The Lieber Code, the Hague Conventions and regulations, and also the Geneva Conventions refer in their treaty text to property. Only one of the most recent one, Additional Protocol 1 and 2, which were drafted in the 70s, they refer to object. They abandon the use of property and refer to object in their treaty text. The general commentary to this Additional Protocol 1 states that an object needs to be visible and tangible. And the Talon Manual subsequently says that an object is not to be interpreted as including data, so ruling out everything in cyberspace. So there are no specific rules, and there is no sources on this. I found that property is protected. So when I started to looking what is exactly covered under this protection of property, I came across a number of trials which were held following the World War II. The Krop and Ich Farben trials were trials against industrialists who were sued for the war crimes of plunder and pillaging the occupied territories. The American Military Tribunal found in 1948 already that property offenses recognized by modern international law include all kinds of property. And subsequently, in the Ich Farben trial, they say, in our view, offenses against property do not admit any distinction between physical properties and intangible property. And I argue this intangible property is where the intellectual property comes into play. However, since there are no other sources on this topic in international humanitarian law, I had to benchmark my findings to see if this argument I'm building makes any sense. So therefore, I looked to the system of international human rights law, and I found that in international human rights law, there's actually the same discussion going on for a while, and this has been developing. The European Court for Human Rights said intellectual property enjoys the protection for property. In the Charter of Fundamental Rights for the European Union, it says intellectual property shall be protected. The Inter-American Court for Human Rights says the right to property includes all movables and immovables and any other intangible object capable of having value. So here I find an argument for my answer to the question that intangible property includes intellectual property. And that is including under the protection offered to property under international humanitarian law. So there are good arguments that intellectual property is of provided protection under the property offenses of international humanitarian law. However, this also means that there is a divergence of protection under the same body of international human law. We have one body, but two different forms of protection. When we discuss property offenses, the one in the Hague Conventions and Geneva Conventions, intellectual property is an intangible property and is protected. Are we discussing it under the conduct of hostilities, Additional Protocol 1 and 2, it is not protected because it's not visible and tangible. So one body of law, two forms of protection, and it's unique because it only surfaces in cyberspace, because only in cyberspace this visibility and tangibility criteria kicks in. So the outcome. I found that under the property offenses paradigm, intellectual property can be considered of having protection against a number of property offenses. Plundering, pillaging, destruction, seizure, or being taken as war booty are all possibilities. In my research, I argue that it's, for example, possible to seize intellectual property by ransomware, or you can destroy it by corrupting, or you can plunder and pillage it by copying and subsequently erasing the files. And what's also interesting, before this argument, if someone would steal your server or would steal your hard drive, the hard drive would be protected, but your intellectual property on it, not. And then, under the conduct of hostilities paradigm, intellectual property is not offered protection, since it's lacking this visibility and tangibility requirement. Therefore, one body of law, diverging scope of protection, and this problem only surfaces in cyberspace. I have a small recap of my findings so far, and it's done by not my president, but by President Trump.
Well, that's it. And you know, cyber is becoming so big today. It's becoming something that a number of years ago, a short number of years ago, wasn't even a word. And now the cyber is so.
The other one here.
If you look at what they're doing with intellectual property, $300 billion a year. I mean, you look at what they're doing with the way they steal our intellectual property, our intellectual rights. I mean, it's crazy what they're doing. I mean, you know, there's like no laws that pertain to that.
So, on one hand, the cyber is so big, and on the other hand, he argues there's no laws for it. So he's partially right. There are laws for it, and with my argument, I could argue that intellectual property is offered partial protection. So when we are here at CyCon discussing defending the core, I argue that if you want to defend the core, you should protect the core. Intellectual property industries are becoming of great importance to industrialized, digitalized economies. It's becoming one of our cores. Attacks on intellectual property are considered the greatest transfer of wealth. It needs to be defended. International humanitarian law had not caught up with intellectual property. There was no explicit protection. However, my research demonstrates that there is now an argument that there is partial legal protection for intellectual property under international humanitarian law, which once again demonstrates that international humanitarian law is capable of being applicable and used to modern technology and warfare. So some conclusions. What did my research bring? A better understanding of the protection of intellectual property under international humanitarian law. I exposed a normative gap between the property offenses and the conduct of hostilities and the protection it offers to intellectual property. And I demonstrated that it is unique to cyberspace. And I offered a partial solution. So what needs to happen now? States in general adhere to international law and international humanitarian law. Therefore, states need to act and take this protection into account. It needs to be taken into their strategies, in their doctrines, and their rules of engagement. And finally, there's now finally one source on this, my article, which is pending for publication at halfway this year. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. Are there questions?
Sorry, first I need question from the audience. Please, we could have some question from our jury members, because let me say, this judge will be assessed by this so please, jury members, if you have any specific questions on this topic, Tomáš, have you any
there are much more venerable experts here on the IHL than me, so maybe if they have something.
So what was the property involved in the IG Farben case?
A number of things, including shares, stocks, and I believe also some patents.
So with respect to the shares and stocks, you didn't, so this has come up before, and it comes up in the context of destroying data that results in a pecuniary loss. And the classic example is I go into your bank account and I destroy the data. You actually do lose something tangible because you see, you could get the money out of the ATM, but now you can't get the money, which I can touch and feel, it is tangible, out of the ATM. And when the Tallinn Manual Group considered this, they considered that the intangibles, and I did not remember the IG Farben case that well, But I want to say that the discussion went along the lines of those represented tangible property. So they may be intangible now, but they are those things which are readily transferable into tangible property. So I'm asking you now, how would you respond to that? And then I have one follow-up.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, interesting question. Thank you, Professor Smith. When discussing intangible properties, in the trials, the IG-Farben and Krupp trials, they say that things are capable of having value but without existing in the real world. Therefore, they should, if you exclude these from having property, you limit the effective protection property protection affords.
So you would limit your holding to those objects that are subject to intellectual property rights. Is that correct? You're not one of these data is object people, are you?
Well, I'm put on the spot here. Now, I would say...
Because there's a significant difference between saying there's a legal right in something, that something is represents legal right, and something saying, well, it's ones and zeros, it must be a thing.
Yeah. Now, I believe that the intellectual property as a right is afforded protection as property. However, the data as an object discussion, I find it interesting because if you look at intellectual property rights, they provide protection to something which is not visible and tangible. So I'm not saying data is object, but I would say that if you can qualify data as being something which is offered protection under existing law, for example, this data is a picture, so you can, and then you could say it qualifies as something already under the existing normative schedule, so it's offered protection as property.
Okay, can I ask one quick follow-up, because I've got to run. But first of all, I enjoyed your presentation very much. So we know each other. If the audience doesn't know this, we know each other from previously. My second question would have to do with the application or the analogy to international human rights law. It's very common for scholars, even grade scholars, to go into other areas of law desperately in search for something similar and then draw analogies. But the problem with the analogy between international human rights law and international humanitarian law is in international human rights law, it has a different object and purpose. The object and purpose is to protect the individual from the state. Whereas in international humanitarian law, there is, as Laurent will tell you, there is this purpose of that is humanitarian in nature, so it's focused on the human. But it's really about balancing military necessity, as we've heard a couple times here, with humanitarian concerns. And so when you draw the analogies from other areas of law, you have to be sensitive to the object and purpose of those differing bodies of law and ask whether or not that those differing objects and purposes break down your analogy. Did you think about this?
And I'm not trying to compare an analogy of or state that international human rights law should be applicable during times of armed conflict. I'm only trying to, after the end of the Krupp IG-Farben trials, the discussion on intangible property or intellectual property has come to an end because following World War II, intellectual property and armed conflict never met again until now, which is in cyberspace, it's becoming a point of interest. In the meantime, the international human rights law and the protection of property and what's included under this has developed. So I'm not saying that because of international human rights law, it should be it should be transposed to the international humanitarian law. I'm only sketching the development of the discussion, and then because I already found the conclusion in the Krupp and IG-Farben trial, it's to benchmark my findings. So I'm perfectly understanding that international human rights law and international humanitarian law provide are for different purposes. It's about the development of the discussion, which throughout history in human rights law has been developing, and in international humanitarian law it stopped after the Krupp and IG-Farben trial, and now thanks to cyberspace it's picking up again.
It's a very good and a very sophisticated paper. It's good work.
Thanks.
Any more questions?
I agree. Professor Smith is very interesting, although my background is more in the technical, but I still try to be kind of objective and not to. Still, you know, first of all, one kind of observation, you did a significant research, really the 450 documents, papers, books is by itself is a kind of achievement. Now my question the following is, in order to make sense out of these documents that you analyzed, maybe did you have some kind of classification? You know, why did you took this paper but it didn't took some other? Because there is a, you know, there is available much more papers on that. So, you know, have you developed some kind of understanding the basic concepts and meanings and the relations between them, which encompass, you know, the area of intellectual property specification?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, and as I started out with my presentation, there are no direct sources on this topic. So my first point would start, how is intellectual property protected under international humanitarian law? No answer to this question based on sources or reference. Then I started to look at property. How is property in the column of international humanitarian law? What, if we talk about property, what are we talking about then? What is the definition, as legal and lawyers always try to look for? So that once I got this definition, I could see what falls under it, and then how does this relate to intangible assets, for example, such as intellectual property? And then I tried to find the intangible part, to find the conclusion, to limit myself only to international humanitarian law and intangible objects. Since that yielded no result, I started to look at human rights law to see what is intellectual property there. And then in this column, international human rights law, used my findings to see the development of the discussion in international humanitarian law. Sorry. So I tried first to, for myself, sketch the field of protection of intellectual property under international humanitarian law, then property, and then from there step over to human rights law and see how it is discussed there. If that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you. And I have a follow-up question. In order to understand the basic terms concerning any kind of physical area of human activities, the intellectual property people have to be quite fluent in the technical terms. And there are kind of very slippery roads which are related to the ambiguities in terms what the technical people are using. For example, you read papers in the cognitive radio, and you read papers in the cognitive reasoning. Unfortunately, the words in cognitive radio means totally different what it means in the cognitive reasoning. So it might be kind of slippery road to start to compare things which are not comparable. So it's a more, probably not kind of trying to judge your work, but you know, to understand your forward thinking, what kind of pitfalls that you might face in the future.
Well, I didn't went to international human rights law to find an answer to my question, which I can use as an argument to say intellectual property is protected under international humanitarian law. I just try to understand what in international humanitarian law, what are we discussing when we are talking about intellectual property and intangible assets. So I try to get very granular to the bottom, to the root of this protection. And then I did the same in international human rights law to see what is in the basis of the protection when we talk about property. And in the end, as this demonstrated by the cases, if we all break it down, it's the intangible object, the protection to intangible objects, is comparable.
So, but did you run across such kind of situations where you really had an ambiguity?
Yeah. For example, when you talk about intellectual property law, which is a very immense and incredibly difficult field of law, people often talk about law, intellectual property as property, and you have intellectual property rights, and you have the right to intellectual property as a right, which needs to be protected. So there's to get really to the bottom of what are they talking about. I really had to get down to the core of the articles and the protection they afforded. But I did come across this often, yeah. Thanks.
Any question? Please.
My name is Laurent Giselle from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I have one question and actually a follow-up for my remark, which I will share less even if he left, which I will see later on. The question is, I find very interesting the way you approach it, starting with the protection of property in the Hague Convention. Article 52 with definition of military objective and targeting is viewed as lex posterior and specialist and applying actually the protection and the prohibition of discharging property now in for targeting in armed conflicts. But now if you view 52 as not being applicable to tangible objects, have you made the argument or have you considered that the rule of 1907 continue to apply for immaterial objects? I mean immaterial intellectual property, and that therefore this still regulates that aspect today, including in a way for cyber hostilities, just because they are not regulated by the AP provisions. The follow-up comments for my example is that the distinction made between the money in the bank that can become tangible when you go to the ATM. I think you can make the same argument with the Talent manual, who is still on his computer before being printed. If the content data of the Talent manual is erased, you will not be able to go to a printer to print it and have it physically. So you have the same relationship between the intangible and the physical.
Well, I find the additional protocol 1 with the visibility and tangibility requirement injected a whole unique discussion to talking about international humanitarian law. So now suddenly we need to find out if it is visible or tangible when we talk about the rules AP1 provides. So that's a separate column of international humanitarian law. Around this, there is still the protection afforded by the conventions, the Hague Convention, but also the Geneva Conventions. And this is actually where it gets really confusing, that destruction is a property offense, but it is also something bound to happen under the conduct of hostilities. So when you could actually argue that willful destruction is intellectual property is provided, or intangible assets are provided protection against willful destruction, but not under the rules of AP1 to the conduct of hostilities, which in the end most often will result in the same event. So there's actually these fields of law are contradicting each other when we talk about the destruction. So that's also something I pointed out in my research, that on the one hand, under the property offenses it is afforded protection, but under conduct of hostilities it isn't. While the arguments for this are only the new discussion which was initiated by the tangibility and the visibility requirement.
We have any more questions from our jury members?
So which one of the norms should take precedence according to you, or do you have a personal preference?
Ooh, that's a difficult question. My personal preference. In my thesis, I argued that this contradiction between the protection afforded under the property offenses against destruction and the conduct of hostilities protection to data, it has no legal reasoning behind it. Just the only reason it's there is because they use the word object in the additional protocol 1 and 2. And I would say that under object, all property is protected, but because it's the word object, the intellectual property falls out. So while I'm not putting my personal preferences, I would say that indeed the new discussion on data as an object and the protection for intellectual property is an anomaly in international humanitarian law. Thanks.
You might see without prediction as 52 prevails when it applies, and if it does not apply because it's intellectual property, according to rules it does not apply, and then Article 7 simply remains. Article 7 was also for hostilities. Article 23G starts with during the hostilities, so it was meant to apply hostilities, just that it has been specified by 52 later on, but if it does not apply, then 52 does not say that it allows to target intellectual property. It just say that there are limits on what can be targeted physically, but it nowhere says it's expressly allowed to target intellectual or destroy intellectual property.
We have to continue, and if you have any more questions, I think that we can directly contact you after the
Sure.
session. This contact, so thank you very much for your presentation, Jost, and
Thanks. Thanks. Thanks.
we can continue with our second speaker. In Germany, Mr. Kenneth Geers. He's a control systems engineer that has worked as a researcher and consultant in business process engineering. His early publication deal with scientific modeling and its limitation in the areas of natural and technical systems. His current research focuses on cybersecurity and embedded systems.
Yeah. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this introduction. So my talk is about forensic tool development with Rust. What we will hear. First, I show you what is special about forensic tool development. Then we talk about the new programming language, Rust. We will see how and if they fit well together. And at the end, I hope that we will have time. I have prepared a live demo for you that you can see these things in action. So, forensics. Yeah. Who of you likes crime stories? Yeah. So you are all forensic experts, as I can see. So it makes me always think of these guys in their protective suits who are always the first on the crime scene. And in more general terms, forensic is the use and science of technology to investigate and establish facts in criminal or civil courts of law. This is done by relating human acts to traces using highly standardized methods. Sorry, this should be the other one, yes. Digital forensics is not much different in this regard. We try to prove human system interaction. And the first thing a forensic investigator does when he comes to the crime scene, he takes a snapshot of the system state. And this is done by copying all memory in so-called image files. And these image files will then contain digital traces that will be analyzed later. These image files are huge. Why are these image files huge? They are huge because the memory of these devices is huge. So it's very common to have terabytes of data to treat. We do this later using specialized programs that I call forensic tools in the following. And let me see if my mouse, yes. And so the game is about finding these some bytes and bits in this terabyte that prove you something. And this will lead us to the first requirement concerning forensic tool development. We have to treat huge data. And this means that the programs that treat this data have to be really fast. So our first requirement is code efficiency. Secondly, images may contain malicious code exploiting potential vulnerabilities. Why do we care about this? We care about this because these exploits may warn the adversary that an investigation is going on. And we care about it because we open an attack vector for this adversary, allowing him to falsify our investigation results. The latter argument, I go back to the last slide because I forgot to mention something. So the latter will lead us to a requirement which is called memory safety. Memory safety is a property of programming languages. Some produce code with memory safety guarantees and some not. So for example, Java code is memory safe, Rust is memory safe, and C and C++ code is not memory safe. If you're interested in this aspect, then I invite you, we can talk later about it. Let me just say at this moment that the absence of memory safety guarantees is responsible for a big deal of today's vulnerabilities. So how to do better? For many years, program efficiency and memory safety seemed to be an insurmountable discrepancy. Now a new programming language called Rust promises to cope with this balancing act. Code efficiency is achieved by Rust's zero-cost abstractions. This is one of the design goals of Rust. And the fact that it doesn't have a garbage collector. It doesn't need a garbage collector. And it has a very, very little runtime. Rust's main innovation and unique innovation is the data ownership paradigm. What this means we can also, in detail, we can also talk about later. It guarantees memory safety and thread safety at compile time. And this is the reason why Rust code is so fast, because it doesn't need a runtime for these guarantees. Besides, Rust has other virtues. Also, if you're interested in these aspects of functional programming, please ask later, and I'm pleased to answer you. Forensic, I will take here this. So far the theory, is Rust a suitable choice for forensic tool development? To answer this question, I will present you a case study, the development of a GNU strings alternative with multi-byte encoding support. So what is this GNU strings? GNU strings is a little program which has the honorable age of 17 years already, which is widely used in forensic investigations. Its purpose is to extract human-readable characters out of binary data. So, for example, we can have an image file as input, and then have a look what strings or human readable strings we can find in this input data. GNU strings has two shortcomings. The first is it's not safe. I will talk about this later. And the second is it has no multi-byte encoding support. I show you what this means. So let's see here an input data that I will treat with GNU strings. And you see here, all this is human readable. I mean, not by me, but by some humans, I suppose. And a good tool should detect all of these strings. This example is encoded in UTF-16. UTF-16 is important in forensics because Windows encodes strings in memory in UTF-16, so this encoding is widely used in forensics. Here we see the output of GNU strings, and we see that we don't see many things. So it works quite well with ASCII characters, but all the foreign scripts, they just do not appear. Secondly, GNU strings has another downside. It's not secure. I have here for you a vulnerability report from 2014. So this is, I think, 13 years after GNU strings was published. And it says that the vulnerability allows remote attackers to cause a denial of service and possibly execute arbitrary code and so on. The author of this report entitled it by saying, "Don't run strings on untrusted files." Yeah, this is a nice advice, but for a forensic investigator, it's hard to follow, as you can imagine. Okay, let's do better. As case study, I developed a new alternative to GNU strings, StringsExt, which is a secure GNU strings alternative with multi-byte encoding for about 20 or 25 encodings. Here you see the most prominent ones. It is secure and memory safe because it is programmed in Rust. And here you see the design of this program. So the input stream is cut into slices, and these slices are then fed into different scanners which run concurrently, and the findings are then combined by a merger and printer threads, sorted and then dumped to the output stream. When I use this with the same input data, then this will be the output, and we see that all foreign scripts can be found and appear in our analysis. The results from this case study, so 6 months of coding. When you, in Rust projects, you should expect more bugs in Rust libraries. The Rust language itself, it's quite young. It has only 10 years in age. But Rust is memory safe, and we know that bugs are much easier to detect than memory safety related vulnerabilities of unsafe languages like C. From the result of my research, to give a summary of the result of my research, I strongly recommend Rust for similar projects, as it meets all of the defined requirements, and I presented you the two most important ones. To conclude my talk, I show you here a security advisory. A very recent one I found 2 weeks ago in a very commonly used forensic product. It is a stack buffer overflow, which is a typical memory safety related vulnerability with all the risks we have seen before. So what were these risks? Risk is that an exploit may warn our adversary that an investigation is going on, and the risk is we open an attack vector for our adversary to falsify our investigation. So here I am at the end of my talk. So far this was just a very general overview of my work. I tried not to be too technical because I knew that there were law people among you. But nevertheless, I have prepared a live demo. So this is a two minute demo. Then you can maybe see better what this tool does and why it's so important to have a tool like this. And of course, I'm open to all your questions and be here to answer them. Thank you.
I think that we can start with the question from the June member. So please tell me if you have any questions or...
First, thank you very much for your presentation. I am sure, I hope I followed your kind of basic desire. You know, there is a kind of two levels. One is a kind of more philosophical level concerning, let's say, programming languages, which are dealing with huge amounts of code, big data. And the other level is a more detailed technical, for example, more efficient string processing, for example. My first question is, why you, or actually, why Rust is not using garbage collection? You know, I can play here devil's advocate, and so I understand that you are processing huge amount of data. And and you want to be safe, that your memory is safe. And you know, garbage collection, you know, is really dealing with processes where there are multiple, very different avenues. For example, if we want to reduce garbage collection, the data which goes to garbage, we can, for example, lower the depth of the program, so practically no recursions, practically no side effects, because recursion, or let's say recursion or iteration, then increase the kind of, not let's say false paths, which are not really leading to the end of the problem. Also, minimum side effects. So I understand that, but that it's a kind of very practical desire to reduce kind of the amount of data that you need to understand the meaning, because what you're really doing, you are having a huge amount of data, and you have some kind of interpretation process in order to understand what is that, you know, how to get the forensic results, you know, how to come to the conclusions. So you need to interpret the data, and since the volume of the data is very huge, you want to do your processing as much more efficient and conclusive. So again, why not garbage collection? What kind of benefit you get from that, and what you are losing not having garbage collection?
Okay. 3 questions. So why Rust doesn't need a garbage collector? It doesn't need a garbage collector because of a genius idea. And this genius idea was that it has this notion of ownership. So every little piece of memory, yeah, that is managed by a Rust program has a clear ownership, has a clear owner at any time. So then you have these things you can borrow a memory to someone else, and then you will get it back later. So this allows to define lifetimes in scopes, and when a variable goes out of scope, it can be destroyed directly. And this can be done at compile. Let's say it can be foreseen at compile time, yeah, which is not the case in programming languages like Java. So to answer your question, the first question, it is this ownership paradigm why Rust doesn't need it. Secondly, the advantage of not having one.
But did I understand you correctly? Ownership in terms of it's a single programmer tool.
No. So in programming language you have variables. Yeah.
Okay,
So for yeah. Okay.
It's not a version control here.
No. It's really at byte level.
Yeah.
This ownership. Yeah. And so this is, but what important is this is managed at compile time, and this is what makes Rust so fast. It doesn't need a runtime for these security guarantees like all other high developed languages. The second question, no, I think I answered the second question already. This is the reason why it is so fast. And the third question, I'm afraid I forgot already. Yeah.
There are really always a kind of prelude for the last question, why not the garbage collection?
Yeah. So maybe to add something, in 1999 when I learned Java, I was a big fan of garbage collectors.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And so I could never imagine that this functionality can be guaranteed by other mechanisms. And so this is why I'm so enthusiastic about it. It's a very about Rust. Yeah.
And in this, practically it's impossible to list it on garbage collection.
Yes. And it's just a very simple, genius idea, and I believe it's a real revolution in software development.
And I have a second question. You are lucky because you are doing forensics. So analyzing scenes which already happened. So during your analysis process, the data is not changing because you've got it. It's not a real-time analysis. And because it's not a real-time analysis, probably helps you not to have garbage collection because you don't need to,
So even in real-time analysis, so you, for example, you will capture some packages on the network, and you will analyze these packages. But at the moment you do them, they are static. Yeah. So this package that you captured, it will not change during the time you will analyze it. So maybe the result of the previous package may influence it. Yeah?
So
but this hasn't
I
an
understand
influence.
probably I misunderstood. So during your forensic analysis, are you getting more data, more images, or during your forensic analysis, the situation regarding the data what you get is kind of frozen for a moment when you do forensic analysis?
Actually, both is right what you say. It depends on the scope. Yeah. So when you see, so I will. So for example, what my little application, what it does, yeah, it treats an input stream. It cuts the input stream into slices, yeah, but it doesn't know what the next slice will be. Yeah. So in this case, it is a file that doesn't change, but it could also be some networking traffic that is cut into slices.
So
yeah.
it's a kind of mixed paradigm here. But when you process one slice, and everything is static. But then you get a new slice, and then it becomes great, very interesting.
I don't know if, so I really would like you to show you this short demo. I don't know if you're interested.
Any more questions by the jury members? No? Any more questions? Ken? Okay. So, any questions? I mean, we have a few minutes for one more question.
I guess a clarification, really. Going into forensic, my name is Ray, I work with the Information Systems Agency. And I am a real-time analyst, actually. So cutting it out and carving it into slices, as you mentioned, obviously with forensics, primary goal is to provide data integrity. I imagine you make a bit-by-bit image of whatever disk that you're trying to perform forensics on, and then utilizing your analysis of the forensics from that copy, not from the original, right? Hashing out, making sure that everything's correct. But to clarify, when you say into slices, basically you're compartmentalizing the data, and I imagine probably exploding out those files into various streams is what it seems like it sounds like.
Yeah.
I mean, not to get too deep into the weeds on it, but like you don't have to worry about the garbage collection because, as you said, each is a bit by bit memory that's pulling that information. Is that correct with the programming? Somewhat?
I think I'm afraid that I have not been so clear as I wished to explain these things. Yeah. Yeah. I give you a short resume. Yeah, of what so this batch processing I talked about. This is a design choice of this solution. I could have done it differently. Yeah, this allows me to treat really files, huge data. This has nothing to do with memory safety guarantees of the programming language. Yeah, so you have this input-output. You get a piece of input, you treat it in a certain way, and you push some output. Yeah, so internally this is how it works, and where the memory safety comes into play is when you think of misuse cases. Yeah, so for example, you can have a payload in strings, yeah, that will trigger some buffer overflow. This is a typical misuse case. Memory safe language doesn't allow, there's no possibility to get a buffer overflow. Yeah, and this is guaranteed mathematically at compile time. Yeah, there's no one who has to check during the program, during the runtime, that this security guarantee holds. And this makes the big difference. This makes it so fast, yeah, and secure at the same time. And this is particularly of interest for forensic tool development, because there we really need to be fast. Right. Yeah? But at the same time, security also matters, because we're dealing with adversaries. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I think that we have one more question for the audience. After that, we have to answer, please.
There is a Ricardo Sevilla from Switzerland. There is a quite big amount of forensic tool out there that can be exploited somewhere by the data they're trying to analyze. Wireshark is an example, which had a lot of CVEs. And the complexity of this tool is quite big. So do you think it would make sense at some point in time to for example, rewrite part of these tools in Rust and integrate these elements into original tool? Writing the whole tool is probably not realistic in terms. If you look at Wireshark, for example, you have a module within Lua for dissectors. You have a lot of different types of technology interacting in the same tool. But perhaps it may be useful to rewrite the critical part of such a tool with such a programming language to make sure it don't explode.
Absolutely, it makes sense. So you would start with a library which scans for example. This would be a good start, and integrate this in your product. And this is, by the way, this is done by Mozilla for the next generation browser. So the rendering engine, yeah, of the next generation rendering engine is in Rust. So I expect, so maybe this year or next year, when you browse with Firefox, you actually are a Rust user already. Yeah, and so this is a very, very complex application with many constraints that are similar to what we see in forensics. Mm-hmm.
Okay, continue with the last person. Speaker, we have Mr. Ron Meyer from Switzerland. This is Ron. He is a first-year PhD student at ETH Zurich. And his research focuses on the security and the privacy of networks and its users. In particular, he works on solutions which leverage network programmability to make networks able to detect and mitigate attacks and to provide more security and privacy. So Ron, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present my master's thesis here. So imagine you're an attacker eavesdropping somewhere in a company or campus network. Initially, you don't know anything about the activities happening in this network or about the users that are communicating via this link that you just intercepted. But after some time, you will have observed a lot of packets, and from these packets, you can reconstruct the activities that were ongoing in this network. For example, the hosts that are communicating with each other, how many of these hosts are in the network, and how they are communicating with each other. And from this, you can maybe conclude that there is a set of clients on the one side of this network link and a set of servers on the other side of the network link. But now imagine if the picture would look like this. So imagine that you observe IP addresses, in this case, that are randomly distributed over the whole IPv4 address range. Now you can no longer infer what is going on in this network, given that the traffic is actually the same as in the first part of the example. And my master thesis was exactly about developing a system that changes network traffic from the figure here on the left to the figure on the right. And I will now show you how this works. But first, I'm sure you all know that such eavesdropping attacks are far from being a made-up example. Probably the most popular example was a few years ago. The NSA eavesdropping on Google's private fiber links between their data centers. But of course, eavesdropping attacks are not limited to governmental agencies. In fact, it's very easy to perform such an attack also in a company or campus network. All one needs is physical access to a network link. So usual solutions to mitigate such attacks are to encrypt the traffic. However, this encryption is usually only done on the payload of packets, so on the message basically that you are transmitting over the network, but not on the source and the destination of this of the messages. So in contrast, or in addition to these existing encryption schemes, the topic of my thesis was to develop a system that additionally hides the source and the destination of the traffic in the network. So we call this metadata obfuscation or header obfuscation of network traffic. With this, I come back to the title of my thesis. There we speak about SDN-based network obfuscation. By network obfuscation, we mean basically providing 3 different kinds of anonymities for network traffic. The first is communication anonymity. So we hide the information who is communicating with whom in this network. Second, we hide the volume that is exchanged between 2 particular hosts, because you can no longer group the flows from or to a certain host together. And second, we hide topology information about the network, such as how many hosts are active in the whole network or in a certain segment of the network. We do this based on SDN. SDN stands for Software-Defined Networks, and for those of you who are not familiar with this network architecture, I will have 2 more slides later. The basic idea is to implement the system inside the network, in contrast to have a system that is based on software that is running on end hosts, because we think that in today's network that consists of many different kinds of devices with different capabilities, different resource allocations, it is very hard to deploy a software on all end hosts of a network. So it's much better if one can integrate the solution into the network such that it works with each device that is connected to this network. So I'm sure you're familiar with this kind of networking devices that are present today, maybe in this size or in smaller size. They are essentially composed of hardware in terms of ports where you plug in the network cables, and of software that controls what is happening if a packet or if data arrives on one of these ports. In contrast, in a software-defined network, these 2 parts are split. So, or in other words, the data plane with the hardware is split from the control plane with the software that tells the hardware what to do with packets. And between this open software and the hardware, there is a standardized interface, meaning that everybody can write its own software to control hardware in such a software-defined network. I'll now briefly explain you the architecture in which my system will work. It is, we start with a traditional layer 2 enterprise or campus network consisting of some SDN-enabled switches, so some switches that support this SDN architecture. It does not need to be all the switches, but just a part of them. And these SDN switches are controlled by a logically centralized controller that coordinates how they behave, this is like a key part of this SDN architecture. And then we assume there is an eavesdropper somewhere in the network, eavesdropping on one or multiple of the network links. And in such a network, we can protect all traffic as soon as it has crossed at least one of the SDN devices. So I said before that we have decided to integrate the solution into the network, which means that we cannot modify network traffic before it has actually entered the network, so before it has crossed the first switch in this case. I'll give you now a very short example what would happen if we have such a small network consisting of 3 switches controlled by this logically centralized controller, and host A sending a packet to host B. In this case, imagine the switches are just booted, so to say. They do not yet have any state built up. They will ask the controller how to handle this packet, and the controller will basically tell them or install a forwarding rule on the switches to how to forward the packet through the network. So far, that's just a standard operation of such a software-defined network architecture. But in this case, the first switch will not only forward the packet, but it will also replace the source and the destination IP addresses by a pseudo-random value that does not allow inferring the real source and destination IP address of the packet for an eavesdropper that, for example, sits on this second link between the 2 switches. This anonymized packet is then sent through the network, and before it reaches the destination host, this anonymization is removed such that the destination host receives the original packet. And now the next question is, of course, how does this rewriting work? So how do we anonymize the packets while still be able to de-anonymize them later? And for this, it turns out that there are at least 2 trivial solutions. One of them is to assign just a random ID for each connection, and then to identify the connection based on this random ID, and to write this random ID instead of the IP addresses in the packet. However, such a solution would not scale in this software-defined networking architecture, because it would require to maintain a forwarding rule on each switch for each flow, and given enterprise networks with potentially millions of flows, it's no way to keep millions of these states for such a switch. The other idea would be to assign random IDs per host. This would scale very well because traffic can be forwarded through the network based on the random ID of the destination host. So comparable to traditional forwarding based on the IP or MAC address. However, this approach would not provide high anonymity. It would only hide the actual IP address, but not the communication patterns, for example, inside the network. So we developed a hybrid approach between these two, and I will now show you how this works, also at hand of an example of a packet from host A to host B. In the first step, we map the two endpoints of this packet to IDs. So we have two random IDs representing the source and the destination host of this packet. Then we again take all the fields containing addresses, in this case, the MAC and the IP source and destination addresses. But we do not look at them as individual fields, but just as a bit string of 160 bits in this case. And then some of these bits are selected to contain the source and the destination ID. So the two IDs are basically mixed together and then written to this randomly chosen locations inside this bit string. And since we don't need all these 160 bits for these two IDs, we can replace all the remaining bits by random values, therefore ending up with IP and MAC address fields that contain many random bits and a few bits that actually identify the source and the destination of traffic. But as an eavesdropper, you do not know which of the bits that actually contains information and which of them is just randomly chosen. Only the switches will know on which bits they will have to look at in order to forward the network traffic. So we end up with this anonymized packet that is then sent through the network and deobfuscated before the destination host. Part of the thesis was also to implement this system on top of Floodlight, which is a freely available OpenFlow or SDN controller, which I extended by a set of custom modules that then perform this rewriting task that I just explained. And then we compared the performance of this extended SDN controller to the default version of the controller, and we have seen that in terms of resource usage and load that is imposed on the switches, the extended version is actually even performing better than the default configuration because flows can be better grouped together, and we do not have any impact on the load on the controller and no negative impact on the network performance. So this thesis was also the main part of a publication that we could just publish around 2 months ago. And if you are interested in more information about this project, I invite you to have a look at this website where you can find more information and also the source code of this implementation. With this, I'm at the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope I could explain you the design, how this system works, and what we've shown in the evaluation, that it actually works with real use cases. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's start with our question time, starting as usual from the jury members. Gabriel, any questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Jury. The jury members. Oh, sorry. Next year I will be more involved in our
Apologize.
It was quite interesting presentation, and I would say that, have you heard about, frequency hopping?
Yes.
Yeah. So that was a technique which was used during the World War II in order to confuse, somebody who wants to understand what is your text, and there is a payload channel, and there is a actual, carrier channel.
Yeah.
And in the usual radio communication, the the carrier channel remains fixed. But in the frequency topic, the frequency for the same payload changes very fast.
Yeah.
And what the bad guy hears is only the white noise.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, you had done actually similar thing. Only the payload for you is the real topology, for example. And the carrier topology is the one what you are changing by changing the IP addresses. So for you,
yeah.
what basically is how to change the topology, the carrier topology in a fast way so that the bad guy cannot understand what is the real topology. Have you heard about virtual private networks, VPNs? So basically what you did, you are using not only one virtual private networks, but you are changing with very fastly the VPNs, so the bad guy cannot follow what is the actual topology.
Yes, basically, if we compare it to VPNs, it's one could say that it's like we establish a VPN tunnel between each pair of endpoints, and we randomly change the addresses of these endpoints in additional.
So have you started with the VPNs, or it was totally kind of tangent? You didn't look at this VPN paradigm at all.
We did look at it. So the motivation to do it like this here, the nice part is that you can really integrate this into the network. So you don't have to configure these VPN tunnels. You don't need support from the routers for these VPN tunnels, but you just run this controller on top, or the additional applications on top of your SDN controller.
And did I understand you correctly that such kind of randomization or change is controlled by one central controller?
Yes, in the basic design, yes, it's controlled by one logically centralized controller. So this is kind of given by this SDN architecture. It, of course, doesn't mean that it's really just one machine, but one needs to have ways to distribute or to have redundancy, of course, in this on this controller.
That's a follow-up question. Have you thought, not here, but in the future, instead of one centralized controller, to have a distributed controller? So it confuses even more.
Yeah, that's possible, yes. So there are basically two possibilities how to do this. Either we integrate this in our application, so we distribute this application, which is possible, or we add a layer, basically an additional layer between the actual controller and the instance that communicates with the switches, which already exists for this. So there are already solutions how to distribute a given controller. Then we just put this system on top of this distribution layer, and it already works. Or as an alternative, we keep the existing controller. We don't add this additional layer, but we integrate or we implement the distribution as part of our modules. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So from the perspective of a security analyst, for the enterprise, this architecture poses challenges, perhaps, from a security analytics perspective. Is it harder to know who's doing what and when?
It depends. So it's definitely harder for the eavesdropper. That was the goal, but it's not harder for you as the operator, because you as the operator, you can have, for example, one could create like a log file of this controller, how it changes the network traffic. So basically, keeping a log of this mapping between the random IDs and the actual addresses. And if you then use this for your security analysis, you don't lose any information.
You have basically code book in your pocket.
Okay. And that's is it sort of built into your analysis already, or is that just did you come across that challenge practically?
No, it's not yet built in, but it's I mean, it would be a few lines of code to just keep track of the state instead of only maintaining the current state of the controller.
I'm a lawyer, so I apologize if my question doesn't make any sense, but I did some research on the Tor anonymity network. And could this technology be somehow used to enhance the security of virtual of these anonymity networks?
Yes, it would also for this, in this case. So the application is a bit different. Usually you use Tor over the internet, and our application is more looking at local networks. But of course, also for Tor traffic, you would hide, in this case, the IP addresses of your relays, for example.
Well, we have time for questions from the audience.
Yes. Did you consider using author fields in the IP header to code your address instead of, or additionally to the MAC address?
Yes. So the reason why we've chosen these, the MAC and the IP address fields, was more a technical reason at the point when we developed the system, because the limitation is we do forward the traffic then based on these few bits in these fields. And the OpenFlow, this is this protocol to communicate with the switches, only supports this matching on an exact bit mask for these fields. But it's already for future, or now they are already existing, newer version of this protocol. They also support this matching on other fields or on all fields. And now it would be very easy to just extend this list of fields, or to use basically the whole header or all the fields that you want to hide in the Ethernet or IP layer, yes. Or also higher layers, it's also possible.
Yeah, just real quick. You mentioned IPv4. This is a two-part question. Is this also configurable for IPv6? And as a follow-on, you had mentioned that it doesn't get obfuscated or encrypted until the first and last hop, right? Or deobfuscated and decrypted. So what would be preventing an eavesdropper, for this example, from finding out the information either on the first or last hop if they got on the legs?
Yes, so for your first question, for IPv6, this is easily adoptable. The principle is exactly the same, just the fields change, or in this case it's even better for IPv6 because you have larger address fields and by this larger entropy in the traffic. And for your second question, if you are eavesdropping on the first or on the last hop, there is one possibility that you could install like a virtual switch on the host directly. So if you really want to protect this link as well, you could have a virtual switch installed on the host that then also does this rewriting already on this link. There you just have the problem that because it's really this first link, by definition, you only have the traffic belonging to this host crossing this link. So you cannot have exactly the same anonymity properties. And also, we argue that if you are eavesdropping on this very last link, the chance is high that you are actually sitting on this host, and by this anyway can see what this, who this host is communicating with.
Thank you. Time for one more question.
I have a question about the valid bits, the choose of the valid bits in to reconstruct the address. So you select randomly a set of valid bits, and then you put random value in the others, right?
Yes. So also on these valid bits, on these positions, we insert this also randomly chosen ID. So we also modify these bits, but these bits are not randomly chosen or not uniformly randomly chosen, at least.
Okay. But then the middle switches need to know the position of the bits.
Yes, they need to know the position of the bits belonging to the destination ID because they only need to know the destination of traffic and not the source.
Okay. This means that each switch knows the position of each bits for each flow. Is that right?
Yes, for each flow that goes via this switch, that's right.
Okay, and this is sent, how do they recognize the flow in order to extract the right bits?
They have a set of rules, basically, and each rule says if, for example, if bit 1 is 1, bit 7 is 0, and bit 18 is 1, then this is traffic that goes via, that should be sent via this output port. And they know this kind of mapping, the bits and the values for each flow that is, or for each destination that is communicating over the switch. And they have just a list of all these matchings, and they take the actual header that the packet has and compare it and look which of the entries in this list matches.
Is that only for the SDN switches?
Yes, that is only for the SDNs.
But non-SDN switches sent to all the boards?
No, they send it also to the right port, but there is a bit more hidden behind that I didn't have time to go into the details. But you can trick basically these legacy switches to also forward traffic to the right destination.
Really last question for you?
Yeah, it's a maybe tricky question. So now you put a lot of effort in designing this advanced SDN network. If you were the attacker, where would you try to squeeze this now? Can you do something with the random number generators maybe, or how would you attack that? Now, come on, you thought a lot about this.
Yeah, so one point, the most interesting point to attack it is probably to attack the controller, because there you have the information that you can gather. If this controller is not protected enough, then this is certainly the weak point in each. Or DDoS, yes. But this is the weak point of each of this architecture, basically. And there is a lot of work on how to secure this controller and how to make it available.
Okay.
Thank you.